Hello and welcome, ladies and gents, boys and girls, story lovers all over the world, to another exciting episode of Never Lost, where we retell the old Scots folk tales and fairy stories so that they will never be forgotten. The story that I will be retelling today is one of my favourites. It has been adapted many times, but the earliest versions come from old Scots ballads from the 1600s. It's called The Twa Sisters, or sometimes The Bone Harp. Before we start, though, a quick disclaimer. There are some adult themes in this folk tale, so this one might not be suitable for young children. I know a lot of fairy stories can be dark, especially the Scottish ones, but today's tale touches on premeditated murder and suicide. So if that's not something that you want to hear in a folk tale, please stop now and go and listen to one of the many less depressing stories that I've told. Right, now that that's out of the way, without further ado, let's sit back and start the story. A lang, lang time ago, when there were fairies and brownies and kelpies and selkies, and magic still lived in the forests and moors of Scotland's bens and glens. There was once a king in the fair county of Ayrshire who had a castle on the top of the rocky cliffs of the western shores. The king was a good man, and he ruled the surrounding land with a kind hand. Many people now believe that the king was the master of Dunure Castle, the ruins of which still stand today about 5 miles south of the town of Ayr, and they are well worth a visit if anybody listening is ever in that area on the west coast of Scotland. The king was well liked by his subjects, and they were all very pleased for their liege lord when his good queen gave birth to a lovely, dark-haired and dark-eyed baby girl, who they named Helen. The royal couple were blessed again 2 years later by the birth of another baby girl. Their second child, who they named Kyla, had golden hair and blue eyes. The two princesses were the closest of sisters growing up, and they delighted everyone in the castle, including their proud parents. Dark-haired Helen loved her younger sister Kyla very much, and often the two young girls would go to the rocks by the sea and sit and listen to the waves as they lapped slowly closer with the rising tide. Sometimes Kyla rested her head in her older sister's lap, and Helen would sing to her sweetly, stroking her long golden hair while the seabirds called overhead. As the years passed and the girls grew, differences in their characters became apparent. Helen became a quite lovely, black-haired young woman with dark green eyes like the deepest ocean. She was confident and commanding, fearless and proud. Kyla, in contrast, was the gentlest and kindest soul that anyone had ever met. She had her father's empathy and generosity of spirit, and she was loved by all who knew her. Also, although Helen was quite lovely, Kyla, with her long golden hair like corn in summer, and eyes the colour of cloudless skies, was stunningly beautiful. This never caused quarrel between the sisters, for Kyla was quiet and humble, always telling Helen how pretty her older sister was. Brushing her hair in their bedrooms, Kyla would say how much she wished her hair was darker, and how well it complemented Helen's dark green eyes. As the two princesses continued to grow into young women, Kyla continued to be the delight of all who knew her. Her kindness and her generosity blossomed alongside her stunning beauty. She was often seen in the castle's walled gardens, helping the gardeners to tend the flower beds. Dark-haired Helen could never understand why her younger sister did these things. In stark contrast to fair Kyla, Helen grew more distant and aloof as the years passed. Her confidence developed into vanity, and her pride changed into a cold sense of superiority. One day, a brave and handsome young knight called at the king's castle. The knight presented himself to the king, and he asked his permission to court the older princess Helen. After all, the king, while blessed with two lovely daughters, had no son or male heir, so whoever married his oldest daughter would inherit the king's castle and his lands upon his passing. The king was impressed with the knight and pleased at the prospect of a match between Helen and the brave young man. He gave the knight his blessing. The knight wasted little time, and he began to shower dark-haired Helen with gifts of beautiful silks and gold jewellery as he wooed the princess. Helen was right pleased with these expensive gifts that befit her station, and she became very fond of the young knight. As the knight was staying at Dunure Castle, it wasn't long before he was introduced to fair Kyla. He was quite taken with the young princess, whose golden hair flowed in waves past her shoulders, and whose eyes were the stunning blue of cloudless skies. It could be that the knight fell immediately in love with fair Kyla, or it could be that over time, as he got to know both of the young women, he simply grew to much prefer the company of the younger princess, who was warm and generous while Helen was cold, and kind where Helen was prideful and vain. However it happened, it was soon clear for all to see that the young knight spent more and more time with fair Kyla and less time with her dark-haired sister, Helen. Indeed, as the months passed, the servants of the castle certainly noticed it, and they often spoke of what a good match Kyla and the knight would make, and what a shame it was that Kyla had not been born first. Helen, too, was aware of the change in the knight's behaviour. She was also probably well aware of the servants' gossip, even though none would dare speak such things in her presence. Helen was hurt and angry at what she saw as her sister's attempt at stealing the man who was hers by right. Fair Kyla, though, wanted nothing more than for her dear sister to be happy, and she did everything in her power to redirect the knight's affections. Helen, though, knew nothing of her sister's efforts on her behalf, and she became jealous of Kyla's fair beauty and of the apparent effect that her generous nature had on the young knight. The more time the knight spent with Kyla, the more Helen grew to resent her younger sister. Seeing the knight's face light up at the sight of fair Kyla was a bitter pill to swallow for prideful, dark-haired Helen. She belittled her sister's kindness, calling it foolishness, and she began to criticize her sister and put her down at every opportunity. When her knightly suitor was not to be found, and Helen knew he was somewhere spending time with her sister, she would withdraw into her bedchamber and seethe in dark, green-eyed envy. It was from the window of that very bedchamber that Helen witnessed what was, to her sight, the final betrayal of her sister. Kyla was in the gardens, tending a flower bed, when the young knight approached her. They had a conversation that seemed, from a distance, to be intimate, and it finished with an embrace that was held to Helen's jealous green eyes for entirely too long, and was too affectionate for two people who were not in love with each other. Helen was furious. How could her sister do this to her? Kyla was clearly encouraging the affections of the young knight, who she knew was virtually betrothed to her older sister. Consumed by jealousy and anger, Helen conceived a cruel resolution to the situation of her traitorous young sister. Had Helen actually heard the conversation between her sister and the knight, she might have felt and acted quite differently. For the truth of the encounter was quite different to the awful scenario that Helen had envisaged. The young knight had indeed approached Kyla in the garden, and he had indeed professed his affection for the fair-haired princess. However, in answer, Kyla had told the knight that while she cared for him deeply, there was no amount of affection in the world which would lead her to hurt her sister. Kyla knew full well that Helen had fallen for the knight, and she could never come between Helen and her happiness. Kyla impressed upon the knight that while she could and did love him as a brother, it was Helen who would love him as his queen. The truth, though, mattered little now. Helen's misplaced jealousy and anger had set her feet upon a path from which there was no turning. The next morning, Helen went to her sister in the garden. She told Kyla that she was saddened and sorry that they had drifted apart over the past few years, and especially since the coming of the young knight. Helen suggested that the sisters take a long walk together along the beach and the rocks at the shoreline, as they had so many times when they were children. Gladdened by the thought that Helen wished to repair her relationship with Kyla, the younger sister agreed without hesitation, and the two young women set off in the early afternoon as the tide began to turn. As they walked, Helen and Kyla talked, as they used to, and Helen seemed closer to the caring older sister that Kyla knew as a young girl than she had been for many years. When the two women reached a stretch of familiar rocks, Helen said, "Dearest sister, remember when I used to sing to you on those rocks? We would listen to the sound of the waves and the sea-birds for hours. Let us rest a while, as we once did, and reclaim the sisterhood that has seemed recently lost to us." Kyla was happy to oblige her sister. After all, she was tired from the long walk, and she felt closer to Helen now than she had for many years. So Helen knelt on the rocks, and Kyla rested her head on her older sister's knee while Helen stroked her long golden hair. Dark-haired Helen stroked Kyla's golden hair slowly, and with the same rhythm as the waves of the slowly rising tide. Helen saw her sister's blue eyes slowly begin to close, as they had so often when they were children, and she began to sing to Kyla. She stroked and sang in time with the waves, slow and steady. The song she sang was a sweet, simple lullaby, and Helen never stopped stroking her sister's golden hair as she softly sang, "Rest, little sister, with your head on my knee. Listen to the sound of the soft, calm sea. With each lapping wave let your tired eyes close. Listen to the sound of your breathing as it slows. I'll be here with you, by your side. Listen to the sound of the rolling tide." Before long, golden-haired Kyla was fast asleep. Helen continued singing as the rising tide lapped closer and closer. But now she began to gently tangle and tie Kyla's golden hair to the kelp and seaweed, which was anchored to the rocks around them, twisting and tangling Kyla's golden locks and tying her sister to the seashore's rocks. By the time the rising tide began to lap at Kyla's feet, waking the young princess from her sleep, she was fixed tight to the rocks and unable to so much as raise her head, so tightly was she tied to the seaweed. From farther up the rocky shore, Helen watched as her sister struggled in vain to get free from the kelp and seaweed before the waves began to cover her body. But her efforts were useless, and before long the rising tide covered fair Kyla's face, and as Helen watched, she said under her breath, "Let the sea's rising waves overpower you. Let the currents and tides take and devour you." Kyla's body was most certainly drowned and washed to sea by the waves. However, many people in the county of Ayrshire believe that at the very last moment Kyla's spirit was rescued by the Selkies and taken to their home in the land under waves. Selkies are mythical creatures in Scotland who can take the form of seals or men or women, and Helen had seen two seals' heads bobbing in the water offshore while she was carrying out her foul deed. However, whether Kyla's spirit was taken by the Selkies or not, Helen had certainly murdered her fair younger sister. Everyone in Dunure Castle was devastated when Helen returned in the afternoon and told them that Kyla had slipped on the rocks and been swept out to sea. The king and queen had boats sent out to search for her, but there was no sign of the young princess. However, even in the face of unbearable grief and sadness, life in Dunure Castle went on, and before long Helen and the young knight were engaged to be married, and the king, queen, and the castle's servants were able to forget their sorrows for a time, at least, as they prepared for a royal wedding. You might think that Helen would be pleased, but seeing the grief that she had caused her mother and father made Helen realize the enormity of what she had done. Helen was haunted by guilt and tormented by memories of her happy childhood with her sister. In the mirror of her bedchamber, she saw the image of Kyla when they were young as she brushed Helen's hair and told her how pretty her dark eyes were. I said before that boats were sent out by the king and queen and they found no sign of Princess Kyla. However, on a sandy beach many miles from Dunure Castle, Kyla's lifeless body washed up on the shoreline. It was found by a famous bard who was struck by the stunning beauty of the princess whose body he had stumbled across. The bard had never seen anyone who looked as pure and as pretty as Kyla. He remembered being told of a fair princess with golden hair who sang as sweetly as any songbird. The bard buried Kyla not far from the shoreline, but not before he had used the bones of the poor princess to fashion a clarsach, the likes of which had never been seen before or since. A clarsach is a Celtic lever harp, and the bard used Kyla's breastbone to make the crown at the top of the harp, and her finger bones to make the levers. Finally, he strung the instrument with the princess's golden hair, and the sound which echoed from the harp when it was plucked was as sweet as any songbird. Meanwhile, at Dunure Castle, the preparations for the wedding were complete, and the day had nearly arrived. The guests were invited, the castle was decorated, and the feast was being prepared. The king had even invited a famous bard to play at the wedding, a bard who was said to have a harp which sounded sweeter than any songbird in all of Scotland. On the morning of the wedding, the guests were seated in rows in the castle garden, and everything was ready. The only thing that the ceremony was waiting on was the arrival of the famous bard, who got there in the nick of time, as the groom was waiting at the altar. The bride, Helen, was ready to come down the aisle as soon as the bard began to play. He unpacked his incredible harp as he got ready. However, as soon as the harp touched the ground within the castle, it began to play all by itself, and even more shockingly, it also began to sing. To Helen's dismay, the song that the Bone Harp sang was a ballad, telling the full story of everything that she had done to her sister. Helen was powerless to stop the song, and soon everyone attending the wedding knew what she had done and what she had kept hidden. Tears streamed down her face as the Bone Harp sang out. All those who listen now take heed, as I tell you, an awful deed, done in jealousy and pride, by the hand o' this fair bride, by the hand o' this fair bride. She thought her sister might steal her man, so cruellest murder the bride did plan. She took her sister tae the sea, I ken it's true, for the sister is me, I ken it's true, for the sister is me. She lay my head on her knee there, and softly strokit my gowden hair. She sang a song, baith slow and sweet, until my een were closed in sleep, until my een were closed in sleep. Then she twisted my gowden locks in tae the seaweed o' the rocks, And as the tide began to rise, oh, she stood aside and watched me die, oh. She stood aside and watched me die. As the last words and the final notes of the Bone Harp song hung in the air, the king and queen, with their heads in their hands, wept as they hadn't wept since the day Kyla had been lost. The young knight who was stood at the altar turned and walked away, hiding his face in his sleeve, and the guests looked on in shocked horror as the harp finished its sad song. Helen ran from the top of the aisle and fled the castle in disgust at herself and guilt at her terrible deed. She didn't stop or even slow down until she reached the high cliffs above the sea close to the castle. And when she did reach the cliffs, she barely slowed down even then. As tears streaming from her eyes, she flung herself from the top of the cliffs and out towards the rolling sea below. Some believe that Helen drowned in the sea, like the sister she had herself murdered. But it is also said that some of the guests at that wedding followed Helen when she fled, and they saw her leap from the cliffs. These guests swear that the black-haired princess never hit the water. Instead, they claim that as she fell, her body changed into that of a great black cormorant and disappeared across the tops of the waves. All cormorants in Scotland today are said to be descended from the transformed Princess Helen, and each time any of these birds dives beneath the sea, they look down into the deep darkness in case they catch a glimpse of the spirit of Kyla, which Helen hoped had indeed been rescued by the Selkies and was living somewhere in the land beneath waves. That is the end of the sad story of the Twa Sisters, or the Bone Harp. Thank you very much for joining me in keeping these stories alive. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please leave a like or a comment. And I very much hope to see you next story.